Okay, so let's get going. We're of course quite pleased to be presenting here, and we've presented before at these conferences, and it's always a pleasure. So let's start right away with I think possibly a somewhat stark observation that humanity is at a threshold, and there are just so many elements around us today that are contributing to uncertainty and insecurity. For example, it's really astonishing to think that we've now reached a state where more people have access to mobile telephones than to safe drinking water. This is not only a digital gap, it's a life support gap, and it's getting worse. And this is something that we really need to be thinking about and trying to help solve. There's also a new report from the United Nations Development Program that highlights a new generation of threats to human security. Now, some of these may seem familiar, but they now present new facets that we have to contend with. So, for example, one of the biggies is polarization, extreme polarization in a variety of societies. Bullying is not new, but bullying on social networks is new and has been added to the list. In the area of digital technology, you can see there are a whole host of problems and threats, in addition to all the good things that digital technology brings us, including algorithmic bias, which I think we've all contended with at one point or another. In health, one of the areas, not only the pandemic, but climate change has health ramifications, producing hunger, malnutrition, disease, and so on. But climate change also influences the question of violent conflict, because when people are migrating due to climate change that makes their homeland no longer habitable, that drives more conflict. More conflict drives more migrations, and we get, an unending loop. A blatant example of the kind of things we're talking about is the asymmetry of access to education and to equal treatment at institutional level for males versus anyone else. So we have, for example, insecurity for girls is compounded when we take into account the combined effort of institutional gender bias and the effects of limits on educational opportunities. And I think we all know in many places this was very, very much exacerbated during the COVID pandemic. So this graph, which is from the UN report, shows very clearly that a compound index of human development shows just how badly that pandemic affected human development, much worse than the global financial crisis of 2008, which is the other green band that you see there. Not only that, but more and more people live within 50 kilometers of some level of violent conflict, which is also kind of frightening if you think about it, especially because we've gotten used to, since the Second World War, thinking that we were more or less a world at peace. Even within the educational world, we've got anomalies that are difficult to explain and even more difficult to correct. And it's very clear that somehow we're doing something wrong. So what can we do as educators and instructional designers? I think the most important thing we can do is listen. What are learners and their families telling us? Not just about their expressed needs, but about their fears and insecurities. And we as professionals in this area need to have an arsenal of diversified resources in order to meet challenges of what they're telling us and in order to help them find their way through the complexities of today's world. Unfortunately, we've been pretty slow to respond. We have a lot of models, especially like these pyramid models that we all know, but so many of them tend to follow a similar pattern. And it should be obvious that these are all linear, hierarchical, and most of all, they are in some way exclusive. they're not enough to meet today's needs in instructional design. We can network the pyramids together in the hopes that this will democratize them, but this represents an instructor's point of view. And we need to ask, where's the learner in all this theory? Are we listening to them? Are we doing anything to help them feel more secure? Well, that's where UDL comes in. There's been a lot of talk about student-centered learning, and UDL has gone a long way towards helping to realize that goal. So what we've done is we've developed some visualizations that we think can be useful for understanding it, not as a methodology or a doctrine, but from a learner's point of view, as a dynamic, personalized process. So we've referred to some of the elements in the CAST model as vectors. Vectors provide strategies for unifying priorities, purpose, and diverse curricular content. These vectors are not just content-oriented. You could use any of them to learn maths or music or literature or anything else. We use the word vectors because the word implies movement. And in this diagram, movement can be towards the center or towards the periphery of the concentric circles, where the periphery represents higher levels of abstraction. So any learning activity could begin at any point on any vector, and they can be simultaneously on different points of different vectors at the same moment. The learner, therefore, can have different strategies, different mental processes, emotional and social paths for different activities. Now, if we turn this concentric diagram on its side and then try to pull it up into the air, we get a three-dimensional spiral that is not unlike the spiral of inquiry, which I think most of you probably are familiar with. And from an instructor's point of view, this shows us how to organize our work in order to diversify inputs, process, and outputs, in order to have multiple resources, strategies, and itineraries at different levels along a path. And this allows us to offer learners a rich ecosystem that facilitates personalization on lots of different levels. So on this personalized learning spiral, we go beyond a traditional linear classroom instructional design to create iterative learning objects and experiences, somewhat similar to, if you're familiar with it, the principles of agile software design, where each iteration has its own path and each learner has their own set of iterations. Seen from a different angle, we can have a planned linear path through our material, somewhat like the yellow line in this diagram. But learners will often choose to follow an associative path through the material, zigging, zagging, according to their needs and motivations, more like the blue line. So in other words, while we may have a well-constructed linear path for learners to follow, in personalized learning, they can also make quantum jumps from one level on the spiral to another. Others can also choose to jump backwards or even start over. And each jump has its own set of vectors and iterations. So this is what we mean when we talk about diversity of learning. We have multiple motivations, multiple sequences, multiple output strategies. The danger of all this, of course, is that we can fall into the famous personal bubble, where the learner can be isolated within their own personal learning cocoon. And we'll address that in a moment.
And here's where we can think of what are educational systems doing, actually. We've been seeing different paradigms, and all those are quite theoretical. Now we are going to see how they are working on vectors directly on the field. They are identifying the educational values, the common principles, or the essential common knowledge, attitudes, and strategies, just for prioritize what the students need. And this is how we present it through the spiral. But in Catalonia, in the Catalan educational system, they apply different vectors to emphasize the values or the attitude of the whole culture. Catalonia has two different official languages, and they give parallel systems together with all the structure from the 3 years old to the baccalaureate, sharing the same vectors of priorities and values. All the curricula are competency-based, for instance. All of them are taking care of the gender perspectives. At every level, all the subjects are working with language and communication quality efforts. They put the emphasis on emotional well-being. So they try to unify personalization through the most important attitudes and strategies for all the students, even for teacher trainers. And that's what we are going to see. In Andorra, which is quite close, they also have, in this case, 3 official languages and 3 parallel educational systems. And again, they are focusing on plurilingualism and citizenship through vectors, through attitudes and strategies that put together and help students to feel in an inclusive way in a complex society. They do that by integrating the OECD global competency into all of their old curricula, into all the subjects and the strategies they use. On this webpage, for instance, we can see their educational suggestions for learning sign language. So they are identifying their own context, the one in this particular school, which is the Catalan line, but they also recognize different realities and appreciate others. For instance, in number 1, you can see the little logo that are showing how other schools in the different school systems in the same country are focusing to the same topic. And they recognize this as another value partner in society. So they communicate their ideas and they share. And finally, they take action for collective improvement. And they try to integrate all this, not just with the content in the curricula, but with the strategies and the attitudes that give purpose to what they do. And not just the whole educational system. We also have many associations, both in Catalonia and in Andorra, or even in the south of France, that are using STEM or STEAM or a CLIL and even ICT approaches to develop self-agency and community building. They apply UDL principles to bridge the gap between personalization and community building. We are going to see here some examples from Binomi Technopedagogies, which is an association that works with us, and we've done several projects together. They are very active and they work with Catalan-speaking communities and schools in the south of France, the schools arrels, which means roots. And they also are vectorizing the education with the Unified UDL.
UDL, Universal Design for Learning.
I was thinking in Catalan now. And they apply that to their STEAM and STEM classes. We'll see some examples. Just look at the vectors also. I would like you to pay attention to the instructional flow. With these arrows in blue, for instance, from the screen, we can guarantee the quality of language, one of the Catalan vectors in education. And we can guarantee awareness through gender equity. And we can guarantee something like that. But sometimes we forget that when we provide unified information to each learner and we expect them to work individually, we are not really personalizing anything. This is not personalization. Isolation, individual tasks, put them in bubbles. This is not real personalization. So we have to be aware of how to apply those vectors. We also have to pay attention, for instance, in this particular sequence, to interpersonal exchange of information, how those two kids are relating to each other. This is important because the way the kids relate to each other will affect the way they relate later to environment, other realities, and even other people and different people in community. So interaction itself opens the way to sharing. We can also see how the internal dynamics are important, because we can notice gender bias, and these team internal dynamics affect the way people interact, even with interaging relationships, or in plurilingual situations, or in cultural and interpersonal dependencies. So we have a lot of difference to work out just looking at this. And all these can build awareness of diversity. And for us, it's important at all levels. The dynamic between teams also can add an additional layer of complexity. In this case, these inter-team dynamics can help us to see how learners react to other communities, for instance, to other teams, to other groups, both individually and collectively. Teams can collaborate, but we need to train them first. Otherwise, they are likely to compete with each other, or even to have a conflict that are difficult to solve. So we also focus on personal well-being, which is not a personal issue. It has become a worldwide concern that must be taken into account, not only for healthcare, but also for personal development and for next generation conviviality. We need to offer an open and flexible ecosystem where every single learner can find their own path, their own place, and feel comfortable. They have to feel the place for learning too. Time-space adaptability is a must today. And obviously, we can't forget about collective well-being, because collective well-being is not just the addition of personal well-being. It is the interaction of a collective effort, the feeling of belonging, and the willingness to share success. So we have to put the emphasis in how they are going to interact to build an ethical culture. To sum up, interaction is a solution. These are its vectors. We need an interactive education to create a collective culture for social justice. And interacting together needs to be built from trust. Initial personal trust helps us to create those links to generate communities and teams and groups. So the responsibility of these communities will help to develop a collaborative culture finally. We need to generate this collaborative culture to create a transformative, sustainable, ethical culture. And we have a lot of challenges to face. We need to apply all these cultures and structures to emphasize the fighting for fake news, for instance, or the scientific rigor. We need to work with evidence-based studies. And we need to understand new kinds of diversity and build strong teams that collaborate efficiently to find common strategies. Well, we are going to work just from here in the development of this coherent vision that allows us personalization and social justice for all in the future. We have a video that really shows the examples in practice. I would like you to pay attention to what we've just been pointing out. And to end up, this presentation will be just 1 minute. It is also from our partner, Binomi, and they apply the vectors of the universal design for learning in the real world with real learners. Just think a little bit about that. don't have here the contact information if you want to contact them. They have a lot of more of examples that are really interesting.
So in order to close this out, we couldn't resist. We had to ask GPT to give us its idea of educational personalization and diversity. And this is what he gave us. But of course, we couldn't leave it at that either. So we'll add our own conclusion to it.
The evaluation of global competency lies in participation, because we are living and working together in a globalized world.
And that vector of participation is critical for teaching and learning at any level in society and in life. So that's what we have to contribute. These are our references, and once everything is archived and so on, you can get them all off the slides, after the conference. And I hope we have some time for questions. Just want to thank you all for listening and giving us your attention.